And our first speaker is Sharon Walpole, who is a director from CASCAID. So I'm going to ask Sharon to the stage to talk to us for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Is the session going all right for you so far? Let's see if I can get this to work here. Okay. Right. So I was expecting a bit more time than this, so I'm going to canter through and fill your brains really very quickly. But today I'm going to talk to you about what's called big data and how that can be useful for careers advice, finding out what young people know and do and think, and also what effect this has on the labour market and on the skills gap. Just to tell you briefly, and I will be so quick, if you want to copy the slides, let me know. But CASCAID, if you're not familiar with it, CASCAID are the makers of Kudos, which is the old, they don't like me saying this, but it's the old Connections Careers portal. It's been used in schools widely across the UK and has been going since 1925. So when we're talking about big data, they've got lots of it now and historically. More importantly, it's about what our philosophy is. The philosophy of Kudos is very much about giving young people, or adults as well, information they need to make decisions about their life and to get them thinking and show them wider opportunities. If you know me from other places, I was CEO of Walpole Media Group, and CASCAID purchased Moving On for me towards the end of last year, and I went with it. Moving On is a magazine. Down in the front here, I do have a copy of the report and the magazine that goes out to schools, colleges, and sixth forms. And we very much share this view about careers advice for young people, which is that it needs to be independent. It needs to be able to tell young people about all the options, whether that's further education, higher education, apprenticeships, or entrepreneurialism, or just going into work. So speaking of big data, there's a lot of data up there. Nice infographic to blow your mind. So just to go through some of those numbers, 25 is how old Kudos is. So Kudos as a product has been going for 25 years. We're about to release version 2 this summer, which will be completely revamped and adding lots of new features based on what our users, both the users from the day-to-day login and from employers and other schools and so on, that want to see in the product. 1969 is the date that CASCAID started. So it's been around for an awfully long time, and this is really key when I start talking to you about big data, because big data needs to have lots and lots and lots of data. Currently, there are 747 careers inside Kudos, and that's growing all the time. When I say careers, are career profiles, where we explain what the career is about, what industry it's in, labour market information, videos, all sorts of information. Plus, this is linked with Moving On in terms of content. So it's contained within the system, which you have to log in and be in. It's also out there in the wild on the net. There are 1.5 million people who've used Kudos to get matched with careers. Again, we'll come back to that figure, but that's a mind-blowing figure when you're talking about big data. Last year alone, 600,000 people have used Kudos, young people in schools in England, and that's the data I'm going to be talking about today. So you're not going to find anywhere that's got that kind of information about careers in terms of what young people are interested in and what they're thinking about for the future. 40 million people have used Kudos worldwide, so we're not just in the UK, and it's #1 worldwide. That's in terms of organisations that use it, and in the UK. I'm going to skip through some of these slides just to give you an idea about Kudos itself. It's one product, but it targets by profile for each age group. So those of you who are involved with careers advice know that there are different attitudes and stages of life, starting all the way from 7 to 11 right through to adult. And the product is designed to address those differently. Now, just to make sure I cater this perfectly for the people in the room, and I've got such short time, can I just see a show of hands of people in the room who are actual careers advisors? Okay, a couple. How many of you are employers? Quite a lot, okay. And how many of you are actually from like a school or college or further education? Okay, great. So The big data report is produced by CASCAID. This is the third year that it's been produced. And what they've done is streamed through all that data and overlaid it and used what's called anonymized data. Excuse me if I'm patronizing, you know what that is, but if you don't know what anonymized data is, obviously we care very, very deeply about data protection of our young people. Anonymized data is when you pull that data up and you're not talking about an individual in terms of their name and so on, but you are talking about sex, gender, age, and how they've answered different processes within Kudos. So what Kudos does is you sign into it, a school registers it and then get those students to sign in, and then they answer questions that eventually takes them to a point where they get a list of careers that, based on their skills, based on their answers, based on their interest, matches to them and then leads them to have a further look. For employers, we're launching in the new version, Employer Engage, where we'll have specific profiles that employers can put a profile in, and if they do go into your specific thing, they can apply to live vacancies. So this data I'm going to talk about to you today is about Generation Z. If you're not familiar with the generation, that says Generation Y, I'm talking about Generation Z, nice slide. Generation Z follows on from Generation Y, which is the millennials. Generation Z were born between mid-90s and to early 2000. These are the generation that's about to come into the workforce now. These are young people who have been born with a device in their hand and are very au fait with technology and are very, very independent in their way of thinking. It's very important to understand that when you look at this data, because this data is from the last year and what their knowledge set is and what they are thinking. So we've pulled out some of the data from some of the questions inside the questionnaire. This is results from the last 3 years on what young people are exploring the most. You can see, not surprisingly, there's quite a mix of traditional careers, but also you're starting to see more of the creative careers. These are the ones that young people are going through our site and looking at quite closely. It also shows that young people have a very simplistic view of the world. Doctor, lawyer, police officer, accountant. They look at those as a career, but what young people don't understand is how that goes out horizontally as well. So you have careers within something like accountancy that might be forensic accounting. If you're not familiar with forensic accounting, it's a bit like big data, where you analyze data to look for anomalies. So where does that sit exactly? Does that sit in accountancy, or does that sit in the world of IT? And what we seek to do is show them different profiles, and there's different ways that they can get there. But one thing that's a highlight from this is STEM. If you look at the top things, there's not a single STEM career in there. In fact, the first STEM career that comes up in the list of interest for them is at 41st place for aeronautical engineering. Disappointing, I know, and that's consistent over the last 3 years, despite all the efforts that's been made to highlight and address the lack of interest in STEM for young people. Also, we found that on the top 50 careers, there are none in there for construction at all. Again, these are two massive industries that are suffering with the skills gap and an issue that needs to be addressed. One of the other questions we talked about is skills for young people and what their attitudes are about themselves, and what they also see is not them, but skills they should have. So interestingly, on our data, we looked at what's positive and what's negative, what they see as a good thing and what's a bad thing. And it's really interesting, but doesn't it make you feel a little bit that their responses reflect this whole attitude in education at the moment that young people are taught to pass exams? So they're saying what they think you want to hear. So yes, they say that maths is a really good skill. They see that as something that's really very important to have as a skill. But then when you actually look and see, none of them want to study it when you go into the sort of careers as well. This slide is on work-based skills. And again, this reflects Generation Z as a type of person. I know we're heavily generalizing here, but they're very positive about being creative, about teamwork, about paying attention to detail. They like to give advice because they've got the world at their fingertip and they can tell you all about it. But when it comes down to what the real world of work looks like, what they find negative, are things like dealing with paperwork, an interest in building structures or construction, being interested in chemistry, working in an office, being interested in physics, working with financial information. How scary is that? I mean, that's kind of the basis of what most careers have at some element in it. And all the stuff up to the top that they're interested in, they want to solve problems, they want to be creative, but they don't want to actually do any work. For skills, what they feel like they're the strongest at, and this is their view of themselves, this is not what we're saying about them. So they're saying that reading, using a computer, not surprising. They think they're very good at listening to other people. Thinking of new ideas, observing things, caring for people. So they're very creative, loving, caring. That's how they view themselves. The weakest, number one, I think is hilarious, is driving. So this whole generation doesn't have a driving license. I don't know. Using a foreign language, safely using equipment, fixing things, teaching, training. So when you start getting into what the actual physical mechanics of what kind of skills you need to do a job in the world of work, they suddenly see that in themselves as their weakest attributes. Skills young people feel that they need to improve themselves or that they feel least confident with. And again, like I mentioned earlier, the number one thing is maths, which I find really alarming. And this is possibly my personal view, but I do think that we've become so obsessed with level 2 maths, we've become so obsessed with qualifications, grades, and so on, that we've lost the ability to teach maths in a way that young people will understand or enjoy. So in terms of things like applied mathematics. I'll tell you a little story that breaks my heart about my eldest son. And this is before I am who I am now, so I want to apologize in advance, as I apologize to him all the time. I didn't know much about how the university system worked in terms of mathematics. He was really good at maths at school. He got channeled down the A-level route. He did maths, further maths, and physics. Everybody thought, hurrah, go to university and do maths. He got good grades, got into Reading, which I'm delighted with. But he didn't know what he wanted to do with maths. So I rather naively said, well, why don't you just do maths? Because then you can choose what you want to do with it. Now you're probably all inside laughing at me, realizing that maths at university is very, very academic, and he's not an academic lad. He went through, and in the end only got an H&D, a broken soul, and couldn't cope with it at all. And even now, he's struggling to get work, and he's laden with £50,000 worth of debt. This is why career advice is so fundamentally important. It's not about what's the right route for us as an industry. It's not about what's the right route for us for business by the kind of linear approach. It's the world, and we must all know this, is more about a spider web, that careers where you end up, I bet everybody in here has a story that you're doing something that you never thought when you were 16 you were going to be doing, and how you got there. We might have been through all sorts of routes and ways to go in. There isn't as big a divide as we try to portray in terms of academic and vocational qualifications. It has to be a healthy mix, and young people need to have that beaten out of them, that they need to understand why they're at school. They're not at school to get good grades. They're at school to improve themselves and look at their future and where they're going to go and get the right qualifications to do that. Somebody shout at me if I'm going too long. This is one that I think is a very interesting one. This is about engineering, coming back to STEM careers. Of the people that we asked, looked at the data, of the responses, 52% of the young people were matched to at least one engineering career. So let me explain what that means. When we say they're matched, that means the skills that they have shown a propensity for, that they like, that they want to do, that isn't obvious to them, like this is a STEM kind of thing. It's just, would be good by employers that have told us we would like young people with these skills to come into our industry. Well, 52% of the young people match that. Sounds fantastic. But then look what happens. 23% of those young people actually viewed engineering careers. This is not doing anything about it, this is viewing it. So the statistics cut in half straight away. And then, even more disappointing, only 9% shorted engineering as a career. So I'm going to tell you another little story. In my career, one of the things I do is meet with employers all the time and hear their stories and their pain, and I've got a particular passion for STEM. I went down to do a feature on Honda Institute for their apprenticeship scheme there, which is fantastic, like lots of them are. And when I got to talking to the head of apprenticeships at the time, and if anybody's from Honda in here, this was 4 years ago, they said to me that I asked what their qualifications were to get on the course. And interestingly, they said, oh, if they get 2 Ds at GCSE, we'll be happy. And I said, whoa, I'm sure it's not allowed now, but even then I was thinking that's incredible. 2 Ds. Surely with engineering, you're looking for something like math, science, different grades, and so on. So, oh yes, well, we used to do that, but what we found is we never got applicants, or certainly not the kind that we needed. So we completely changed direction and decided that we're only going to look for young people who are actually passionate about cars. And frankly, we don't care how old they are, what qualifications they have. Because what we found is we can teach them the level 2 mathematics or functional skills or whatever it is. But if you take a young person who's really passionate about cars, get up onto a chalk and talk and write on the board mathematic equations, they just go and look at it and say, oh my gosh, I don't know what that is, this is obviously not for me. Whereas if they get young people who are interested in cars actually into the apprenticeship scheme, into their facility, put them in front of an engine and turn it on, they start talking about torque and speed and what amount of oil mix it needs. I don't know about cars, but they do because it's inherent to them. And what they don't understand is that is applied engineering, that's applied mathematics. And if you go backwards, rather than saying you have to have this level and baseline of skills, otherwise you won't succeed, rather than going at it with you love this, you can do this, we appreciate you wanting to do this, we'll teach you the skills that you will have to carry on. What this means for a long time for that employer, for Honda, is that most of the apprenticeships, they obviously all get jobs, but stay with them for a very, very long time. And when we're talking about labour market information, it's not just about getting people into the industry, it's getting them to have a passion for it and wanting them to stay. We want the best for young people, we want them to have a career, we want them to have a life that they value and they appreciate, but employers also want a workforce that's going to stick with them, like the old days. When people had jobs that lasted 20 years, now they last 2. And this is why the apprenticeship levy is going to have an interesting impact, because it comes shortly after the cost of going to university. And I was surprised by parents that I speak to, how quickly their attitudes changed. I thought we would be stuck for a very long time with this attitude of, oh, well, apprenticeships, that's all very nice, but my son is going to go to university because that's what he's going to do, because his life will be better. But when I talk to employers, they're saying that actually the graduate scheme hasn't really worked for us because we get graduates in who have too high expectations, both financially and career-wise, and they leave us very quickly. But the parents actually, what was really interesting to me, if we do a good job with apprenticeships, whether that's the lower ones to get people into work or higher apprenticeships, if there's more of them to actually be a valuable option, means that the parents are saying, well, that's fantastic. They're getting work experience, they're getting a qualification, and they're coming out with a job and passion. So I've got 2 minutes, so I'll counter along. But I think that's the importance of understanding this data, is that if you go into the data and look at your industry, and particularly in the subject of STEM, why in the last 3 years has those figures not improved? There have been schemes that have been going on. We need to look at this really carefully with the policies, and this is why I'm quite excited about the industrial strategy. And I have been in with the National Audit Office to speak to them about our data as well, because what a lot of data is out there is pure analytical data. What they don't have is this sort of emotive sort of response and the kind of esoteric sort of responses that are hard to monitor. So I will, so if you want to speak to me about any of this, particularly employers, I'm really keen to talk about employers, because when we're building the employer engage, I really would like to get involvement. I think collaborative working is the only way to get something that is going to be effective. You can email me, that's my email address. I'm also quite active on Twitter. And down on the front here, I've got a copy of the recent edition of Moving On magazine and a hard copy of the Big Data Report, so feel free to help yourself. Also, if you don't want to carry any more paper around today, you can download it from the CASCAID website. I understand there's going to be a Q&A session in a minute, so if you have any questions, rack them up. I'll speak to you in a bit.